Ya da 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 da. Ya da 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 dum ba da da. Ya da 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 da. Ya da 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 da. Ya da 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 da. La 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 la. Da da da. A good vach. Shavua tov. How's everybody doing? Great to open a new week learning with you on a Saturday night. Let's light up the darkness with a new wisdom candle. Who's in the house? Joe in the Inland Empire, Sharon in New Jersey, Lucy in Minnesota, and I'm glad you're here. Melissa in Great Neck, Karen in Northern California, Ryan, wishing everyone a good week and a good evening, Baruch Hashem. Belle, late in Texas, hope you're feeling better. Thank you so much, Belle. You know, for those who don't remember, I had I had an oral surgery last Tuesday, and it's steadily getting a little bit better every day. Very little soreness now. I just have this darn putty in my mouth, which is the dressing covering up the sutures where the gums were sewn up. And it's just so annoying having this thing in my mouth. I wouldn't even mention it, except my job here with us today is talking to you for an hour. And it just gets a little bit irritated. But I have a glass of water and hopefully I'll be fine. Abba checking in from Brooklyn, Bill in mid-Missouri, Peggy in Colorado, Ella says shalom, Franco checking in from Italy, Michelle from Kelso, Washington. Welcome, everybody. Lucy, I'm glad you're here. I forgot to mention at the beginning of yesterday's class, and I only mentioned it at the end. So, you know what? We'll dedicate our learning again in tonight's class to my dear friend who we lost. I guess he died on Thursday, Rabbi Aaron Parry. And he wrote the book Talmud for Dummies. He was such a good friend of mine. We studied Tractate Sanhedrin together. We studied the Siddur, the prayer book together. We had the same birthday, June 16th. We were both Levium. We called each other my brother from another mother. And he guest taught this class a couple of years ago when Nina and I took the kids to Yosemite. And at that time, I didn't think, you know, we had a substitute teacher while I was away. We had two, my friend Abish Rand and Rabbi Aaron Parry. And so Lucy writes, Dear Sal and Nina, I was so sad when you told us last night that Rabbi Aaron Parry had died unexpectedly. I remember him fondly from when he replaced you on the AT Daf Yomi for a few days. He was patient and kind, as many of us, like myself, were such total beginners then. He kindly adjusted as soon as he realized that he was a bit over our heads, and he was an excellent teacher. I have often thought of him in the last few months and wished that maybe he would someday make another appearance, and perhaps we could show him we had learned a bit since he saw us last. After Rabbi Parry's teaching, I did buy his Talmud book, Talmud for Dummies, and also in the same series, his Hebrew scripture book. I have used both of them in some studies with Christian friends who appreciated them also. I am so grateful for his life and teaching and so sad he is gone. He was a very special person. Thank you for introducing him to us. You said he was your friend. I am sorry for your painful loss. May Hashem welcome him in this new stage of life with heartfelt sympathy. Lucy. Lucy, thank you so much. I just could not have said that any better. Rabbi Parry, Rav Aaron, we miss you. And we dedicate our learning again to you today in this class. And may your soul have a tremendous elevation in the world of souls. And we say amen. All right, let's do it. Page 44 here in Tractate Gittin, the 19th volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of the get, the bill of divorce. But we are on an extended digression here in chapter 4. And I mean, I keep summing up how we got here, but again, for tikkun ha'olam, for the betterment of society, the sages instituted certain measures. Among them, or that a get should be signed by the witnesses, and that led to some talk about the bill of manumission with which a slave was freed. And now we're continuing to talk about the laws of slavery as it was practiced in ancient Israel, a place where both Jewish slaves and Canaanite slaves had far more rights than slaves anywhere else in the world. We pick it up just right near the top of 44a. So the sages taught in the Tosefta of Tractate Avodah Zarah 3:16, if a Gentile collected a slave for payment of his debt, or the slave was taken by a sicarius. There was a movie not too long ago, Benicio del Toro, called Sicario, right? And Sicario is the origin, I guess it's a Latin word, the Sicari, right? The Sicari were often soldiers discharged from service in the Roman army, as well as other foreigners who joined the conquering forces, and even Jewish collaborators. And through threats and extortion tactics, they would purchase or receive land as a gift. However, the transfer of the land was performed by ostensibly legal means. And it just goes on and talks about they were violent criminals. Generally, just the word sicarios, which borrowed from the Latin sicare, means assassins or murderers, which is derived from the Latin sica, dagger, which was their weapon of choice, right? So we're talking about here that a slave, earlier, in the last couple of days, we talked about if a slave, which was property, was pledged as collateral for a loan, and what we're really discussing is the idea that a Canaanite slave owned by Jews would become obligated in the performance of certain commandments from the Torah, which was understood as a blessing and elevation in the holiness of this slave. Often, when they would become free, they would convert and become full-fledged Jews because they found that life more meaningful and at a higher level than what they came from. So even while they were slaves, for example, a slave in a priest's house could eat teruma, which a regular free Jew could not eat, consecrated food for that could only be eaten by priests and their households. But there were other commandments as well, in which a Canaanite slave would become obligated by belonging to a family of Jews. If the Jewish owner sold the slave to a Gentile or even to a Jew who lived outside the land of Israel, so now that Canaanite slave could no longer perform those mitzvahs, those commandments. And so his level of holiness would drop. And so the sages instituted that as a penalty, basically, for selling a slave to a Gentile or even to a Jew outside of Israel, the slave would become emancipated, would become free. Now, if you sold him to a Gentile, the Gentile's not going to follow that law. He's not bound by it. But if the slave escapes from the Gentile, right, this could happen even inside the land of Israel. If the slave then escapes from the Gentile, he is free and will not be returned neither to the Gentile nor to his previous master. But because he was sold to a Gentile, he has actually now become free. But here what we're talking about is not that you sold him to a Gentile, but that he was seized by a Gentile. So what they're going to discuss is if the Jew, was forced basically to hand over the slave, where he had no alternative, then this penalty would not attach. And likewise, right, if he was seized by assassins who threatened, we're going to kill you unless you give us that slave. Okay, so then the Jewish owner did not sort of willingly participate in selling the slave into a situation where his level of holiness would drop. So the sages taught, if a Gentile collected a slave for payment of his debt, not that he was pledged as collateral, but that they just seized, an asset of the debtor in order to pay off the debt, or the slave was taken by a sicarius, i.e. one who would use violence and intimidation to force people to give them their property, then he is not emancipated. And the Gemara asks, and is it so that if a Gentile collected a slave for payment of his debt, the sages did not institute a penalty and the slave is not emancipated? And the Gemara raises a contradiction based on what was taught in a Baraisa with regard to a case where the household of the king seized one's threshing floor by force. If they took it for payment of his debt to the king, then he is obligated to tithe in order to render fit for consumption the grain that they seized. And the reason for this is because if he were not to tithe it, it would be considered as if he paid a debt using the tithe, right? So let's unpack that. We're just borrowing the law from a whole other area of the law. But there's this idea, right? So you're a Jewish farmer in Israel when the temple is standing. So 1/10 of your produce has to be given to the Levite. 2%, first 2% is given to the priest, 10% is given to the Levite, and then the next 10% is set aside as the second tithe. Until those tithes are taken out of the produce is unfit for consumption. What if a king comes along and seizes your produce before you have tithed it? Now, he seized, now it's two different situations. One, he just took it. He took it from you. Another is that you had a tax debt or you had some other debt to the government. And so the king's agent came and took your produce in order to satisfy a legitimate debt that you owed to the government. Now, the reason you're going to have to tithe even after your produce was taken is because if they had come along and said to you, pay us, right, what you owe, and then you could choose from your assets what to give, and let's say you chose to give your produce, but you would have taken it from your tithed produce because otherwise it's unfit anyway. So if they take it from your, you would have taken it from your tithed produce that you had already separated tithes out of. So if they come along and seize produce from the stuff that you have not yet tithed, then your tithe, so to speak, is included in what was seized. And if you don't have to separate tithe afterward, you actually benefit, from having what should have been your tithe included in what was seized to satisfy your debt. And that's why the sages said that if they took something from you to satisfy a debt that you had, you will have to tithe it afterward from other produce. It feels harsh, like, what, now I'm going to have to separate tithe for a produce that I don't even have because it was taken from me? Yeah, but it was taken from you to satisfy a debt that you incurred. And that's why you have to tithe it even after it was seized. And so the Bryce indicates that the item taken for payment of a debt is like a sale, which you would have also had to tithe. So why should the slave taken in payment of the debt not be emancipated? And the Gemara answers, it is different there, right? Because now what's the comparison? That, where if I sell my slave to a Gentile, then the penalty on me is the Gentile is emancipated. So if he escapes from the Gentile, he remains free. So that's because I sold to the Gentile. So, but now that I heard at the beginning of our daf tonight that if the Gentile just seizes my slave for payment of a debt, that then he is not emancipated because I didn't choose to give him the slave in payment of the debt. But he was taken to pay for a debt. So since I'm benefiting thereby when property is seized to pay off a debt in the same way that produce is seized to pay off a debt, then just like I have to tithe that produce even after it's taken, why wouldn't the penalty that the slave is emancipated also apply? And the Gemara answers, it is different there because he profits by repaying a portion of his debt with tithe. If they would have taken regular produce, it would have been more of a financial loss for him. Therefore, he must separate the tithe from the seized grain. In the case of this, for the seized grain. In the case of the slave, he did not profit from the seizure. Therefore, the sages did not penalize him. And the Gemara suggests, now, but why did he not benefit, right? If the slave was taken to pay off a debt, he benefited in that way, but I guess what they said is he never would have parted with the slave. He would have found some other way to pay off the debt. That would be the last way he would pay off the debt. Now the Gemara suggests, come in here a proof, as Rav says, one who sells his slave to a Gentile government official, then the slave is emancipated even though the owner agreed to the sale, only because he was pressured by the official. There too, he neither desired nor profited from the sale. And the Gemara answers, there the owner should have appeased the official in some other way so that he would not take the slave. And he did not appease him. Therefore, it is appropriate to penalize him. So the Gemara discusses this further. Rav says, one who sells his slave to a Gentile government official, then the slave is emancipated. And the Gemara asks, what? Right, because you sold it to him. Now, the counter argument is, but he would never have sold it to him if the guy didn't have the full weight of the government behind him to force the Jew to make the sale. So he wouldn't have done it if he had a choice. But they're saying, well, maybe he did have a choice. It's a sale to an official, but he might have found some other way to appease the government official. So the Gemara asks, what could he have done? The Gentile government official forced him to agree to the sale. And the Gemara answers, he should have appeased the official in some other way. And he did not appease him. So Rabbi Yirmiyah raises a dilemma. If he sold the slave to a Gentile for 30 days, then what is the law? Is this considered to be a sale and the slave is emancipated as a result, or is it not a sale? The Gemara suggests, come in here a proof, as Rav says, with regard to one who sells his slave to a Gentile government official, the slave is emancipated. The assumption is that he would be sold to the official in order to work for a limited amount of time or perform a specific task, and yet he's emancipated. And the Gemara answers, there he was sold to a Gentile government official, as this sale is not reversed. No proof can be brought from here with regard to the law of a sale that is in effect for a limited duration. So Rabbi Yirmiyah asked several questions with regard to the extent of the application of this penalty, right? The nuances of when do we free the slave because his master sold him to a Gentile. If he sold the slave to a Gentile aside from his labor, meaning the Gentile will own the slave, but the slave will still perform labor for the Jewish master, what is the law? If he sold him to a Gentile aside from the mitzvahs, aside from the commandments, meaning he stipulated that the slave would still be able to continue observing the commandments in which he became obligated as a slave of a Jewish family, then what is the law? If he sold him aside from Shabbos and festivals, what is the law? Meaning that, the slave could continue to rest on Shabbos and on festivals as a stipulation of the sale to the Gentile. Then do we free the slave? If he sold the slave to a Gentile who resides in Israel and who observes the 7 Noahide commandments, known as a ger toshav, or to a Jew, but who is a apostate Jew, right, an apikorus, then what? A Jew who doesn't observe the commandments. Then what is the law? If he sold him to a Samaritan, right, who observes some of the commandments of the Torah and not others, then what is the law? And the Gemara suggests you can resolve at least one of these questions, as it was taught that a ger toshav, right, the Gentile who resides in Israel and follows the Noahide commandments, he is like a Gentile. With regard to a Samaritan and an apikorus, a Jewish apostate, some say they are like Gentiles and some say they are like Jews. And the Gemara does not answer the question, do we emancipate the slave if he's sold to a Gentile under these various circumstances? Gemara just continues. They raised a dilemma before Rabbi Ami. If a slave fled from his master and gave himself over to a foreign army to serve as a soldier, and his master cannot remove him, neither through Jewish law nor through the laws of the nations of the world, what is the law? Is it permitted for the master to at least take his value from the army, or would this be considered as if he is selling the slave? It's a funny question that sounds pretty hypothetical, right? There's an army passing by, or perhaps even an army attacking Israel. And so the Gentile slave runs away from the Jewish family and joins this foreign army. So the master's not able to recover the slave. It sounds unlikely that he's going to get that army to pay him for the slave that ran off. But if the army was willing to pay for the slave, can he accept that payment and the slave not become emancipated thereby? Doesn't it become a sale? So Rabbi Yirmiyah said to Rabbi Zerika, go out and examine your Mishnayos to find an answer. And he went out and examined and discovered an answer, as it is taught in the Baraisa, one who sells his house in the land of Israel to a Gentile, the monies received from the sale of the house are forbidden to him. Interesting. And why is that? Because the house now becomes a house of idolatry, right? And if there was a Gentile who seized a Jew's house by force, and its owner cannot remove it, i.e. cannot get the house back, neither through Jewish law nor through the laws of the nations of the world, then the Jewish former owner of the house is permitted to take the house's value from the Gentile, and he may even write a document and register the sale in their courts, because he is like one who rescues the money from their possession. Although it is prohibited for a Jew to sell his house in the land of Israel to a Gentile, if it was taken from him by force, he is permitted to take payment for it. Similarly, if the slave cannot be retrieved from a Gentile, it should be permitted for him to take money in return. One who sells his house to a Gentile. This is specifically referring to a Jew who sells his house in the land of Israel to a Gentile, as it is forbidden to give Gentiles permanent residence in the land of Israel, and one who sells a house to a Gentile transgresses this commandment. The Rambam has an alternate version of the text, which reads, one who sells his house for idol worship. According to his opinion, this prohibition applies even outside of the land of Israel, but only when the house will be used for idol worship. Now, where did the law end up on this discussion? Here from Rambam. If one sells his house to a Gentile to be used for idol worship, he is prohibited from deriving benefit from the revenue, and the money must be destroyed. However, if the Gentile seized the house by force and placed idols in it, and the Jewish owner has no way of recovering it, then he may derive benefit from the money. Okay. The Gemara rejects this comparison that if the house is forcefully taken from you and they pay you, then you can use the money. But if you sell the house in the land of Israel to one who will use it for idol worship, then you cannot benefit from that money. Now, can we compare this to one whose slave was seized by an army who's willing to pay you for it? Can you benefit from that money? Or actually, one question is, can you benefit from the money? The other question is, does the slave become emancipated as if you sold the slave to that army? So the Gemara rejects this comparison. But perhaps this matter applies only to a house, since this matter applies only to a house. And that since it is not sufficient, i.e. not possible for him to live without a house. He would not sell it willingly. Therefore, there is no reason to penalize him when it is taken by force. But with regard to a slave, as he can live without a slave, there is concern that he will also come to sell him willingly. And therefore, there should be a penalty in this case as well. Or it is possible that this distinction is not made. In other words, we're not sure if we can borrow this law about selling a house to a Gentile versus having your house seized by a Gentile versus having your slave seized by a Gentile. they're different. They might be different. They might not be. So Rabbi Ami sent the following message to the other sages. From me, Ami Bar Natan, Torah emerges to all of Israel. If a slave fled his master and gave himself to a foreign army to serve as a soldier, and his master cannot remove him, neither through Jewish law nor through the laws of the nations of the world, then he is permitted to take the slave's value, and he writes a deed of sale and registers his transaction in Gentile courts because he is like one who rescues money from their possession. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says, with regard to one who sells his slave to a Gentile, even though he can no longer enslave him, he is penalized and he is forced to redeem the slave from the Gentile for up to 100 times the slave's value. So now we're learning another aspect of this law. Not only is it prohibited to sell your Canaanite slave to a Gentile because that will lower the holiness level of the slave, but and if you do that, and if you do it anyway, then the slave is emancipated, so that even if he runs away from the Gentile or he escapes from the Gentile, he doesn't return to his former master, he doesn't return to any master, he is no longer a slave. Not only that, but if a Jew sells his Canaanite slave to a Gentile, he then becomes obligated to redeem, to buy back the slave, not so that he can own him, but so that he can free him. And not only that, he's obligated to buy back the slave no matter what the cost, according to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, up to 100 times the slave's value. Big incentive not to sell the Canaanite slave to a Gentile. So the Gemara asks, is this amount stated specifically or not specifically? Perhaps the number is a hyperbole. Up to 100 times. Do we really mean that if the slave is worth, slaves were valuable. So if it was a valuable slave worth, 1,000 dinar, are you going to say that you have to buy him back for up to 100,000 dinar? Is that for real? So the Gemara suggests, come in here and answer from that which Reish Lakish says. One who sells a large domesticated animal to a Gentile, he is penalized and is forced to purchase the animal back from the Gentile for up to 10 times its value. And it can be seen here that one who violates an ordinance of the sages by engaging in a prohibited sale must pay up to only 10 times the item's value to purchase it back, and the same would presumably apply in the case of a slave. I just wanted to read a note about this. Right? The sages prohibited the sale of large livestock used for labor to a Gentile due to the concern that this may lead to a Jew renting or lending his animal to a Gentile, who will then perform prohibited labor with the Jew's animal, meaning work it on Shabbos. Right? If your domesticated animal, large domesticated animal, meaning an ox, a horse, a donkey, a farm animal, that's used for work, a working animal. So if a Jew owns that working animal and he rents it out to a Gentile, and then the Gentile works the animal on Shabbos, then the Jew becomes liable for violating Shabbos, right? That's the issue that they were getting at. And so therefore the penalty was, therefore they prohibited not only renting the animal to the Gentile, but even selling it to the Gentile for fear that it would also lead to renting. And once they established that law, then they wanted to give the law some teeth, and they said if you do sell it, you have to buy it back for even up to 10 times its value. So it can be seen here that one who violates an ordinance of the sages by engaging in a prohibited sale must pay up to only 10 times the item's value to purchase it back, and the same would presumably apply to the case of the slave, not 100 times his value, but 10 times. So the Gemara rejects this comparison. But perhaps a slave is different, as each and every day the owner releases him from the fulfillment of mitzvahs by selling him to a Gentile. So there may be a greater penalty as a result. And there are those who say a different version of this discussion. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says that with regard to one who sells his slave to a Gentile, even though he can no longer enslave him, he is penalized and is forced to redeem the slave from the Gentile for up to 10 times his value. The Gemara asks, is this amount stated specifically or not specifically? Is this penalty limited to up to 10 times the value of the slave, or is it more? The Gemara suggests, come in here and answer from that which Reish Lakish says. With regard to one who sells a large domesticated animal to a Gentile, he is penalized and is forced to purchase the animal back from the Gentile for up to 100 times its value. And the penalty in the case of the slave should be at least as large as the case of the animal. But the Gemara rejects this. A slave is different, as he does not return to him. Since the slave will be emancipated once the master redeems him, it may be that the sages would not penalize him to such a great extent. So which is it? Is it 10 times his value? You have to redeem up to 10 times his value, or is it up to 100 times his value? What we know for sure is that you should not sell that Canaanite slave to a Gentile, nor the domesticated animal, and that if you do, you need to buy him back. I mean, it's pretty unlikely that the price is going to go up to 10 times the original sale price or 100 times, but the sages are definitely making a strong point here. Now, the Gemara challenges, what is the reason that he is penalized in the case of an animal more than in the case of a slave? Because of the fact that it returns to him? If so, he should be penalized only one additional amount. If the difference is that an animal returns to its owners and a slave does not, then the difference in the penalties should be reflective of this, and he should have to repurchase the animal for no more than 11 times its value. Rather, the Gemara offers a different distinction. The sale of a slave is an uncommon matter, and the sages did not decree with regard to uncommon matters. Therefore, one cannot compare the penalty in the case of selling a slave to the penalty in the case of selling an animal. Rabbi Yirmiyah raised a dilemma before Rabbi Asi. If one sold his slave to a Gentile and died, then what is the law? Is his son penalized after him? Is the son also required to redeem the slave? Or does the penalty apply only to his father, the seller, who died after the sale? The Gemara compares this to other penalties assessed by the sages. If you say, in accordance with the opinion that holds that if one slit the ear of a firstborn animal, and by doing so intentionally blemishes it so that it may be eaten, and then that person died, then his son is penalized after him, and his son may not slaughter and eat it. Perhaps this is because it is a prohibition by Torah law. Meaning, when you have, you're a farmer and you own a cow, so the first calf that comes from that cow, when the temple is standing, has to be taken and brought to Jerusalem, given to a priest, and sacrificed as the firstborn, right? And children, we don't sacrifice children, obviously, but you have to redeem the firstborn human. But the firstborn of an animal, if it's an animal that is appropriate to sacrifice, was sacrificed. However, blemished animals were never sacrificed in the temple. So if the animal naturally developed a blemish, then it actually was treated like the other animals in the herd. And, for a farmer, for a rancher, for somebody who raises livestock, keeping the value of that firstborn as something that could be sold or eaten, it was a big value. And so somebody might be tempted to create a blemish in the animal so that it wouldn't be sacrificed, but rather it would remain as part of the livestock. Of course, that's illegal. It's wrong. It violates Torah. And so there would be a penalty that if you did that, well, you would lose, right? So the animal would, if you did it intentionally, so now it has a blemish, it can't be offered as a sacrifice on the altar, but neither can it be eaten or sold. However, the person who did that, he's penalized that way. The question that's asked is, what about his son? If he dies after creating that blemish, so now the son inherits, all the property of the father, including that livestock, including that purposely blemished animal. Can he eat that animal, or does that animal remain off limits? Right? And so in that case, the son is penalized after him, and his son may not slaughter and eat it. But perhaps this is because he violated Torah law by doing that. Here, with regard to the sale of a slave, selling it to a Gentile, that was never spelled out in the Torah that you can't do that, and the penalty created by at least the penalty is not by Torah law. I think the penalty for sure is not by Torah law, it's by rabbinic decree. So perhaps we wouldn't say that the father who sold the slave to a Gentile and now he's obligated to redeem that slave for 10 times, even up to 10 times his value, perhaps 100 times his value. But then he dies before he does it. Now the son inherits his property. Is he also forced to redeem the slave? Well, we can't compare to the purposefully blemished firstborn animal that can't be sacrificed and nor can it be eaten, because what's violated there is a rabbinic decree as opposed to a Torah law. And if you say that there is a different comparison, and now we're on page 44b, the law is that there are types of labor that one is permitted to perform on the intermediate days of Passover and Sukkot. One may not intentionally schedule the labor to be performed at those times, and one who does so is penalized and must therefore forfeit the profits of that labor. The law is that if one planned to perform his labor on the intermediate days of the festival, and he died, then his child is not penalized after him, because the son did not perform a prohibited act. Here, what is the law? Did the sages penalize only him, and he is no longer alive? Or perhaps the sages penalized his property by saying that he should lose it, and the property still exists. So Rabbi Asi said to him, you already learned in the Mishna, a field whose thorns were removed during the sabbatical year may be sown after the conclusion of the sabbatical year. Why? You're not allowed to work a field during the Shemitah year, during the sabbatical year. And if you do work the land, then you're going to be penalized and not be allowed to enjoy the produce of that work that was prohibited to do during the sabbatical year. But removing thorns from the land is not like plowing it and planting it during the sabbatical year. All right, so a field whose thorns were removed during the sabbatical year may be planted, may be sown after the conclusion of the sabbatical year. Why? Because removing thorns is not a full-fledged labor that renders the produce of the field prohibited. And it is taught in a Baraisa, if the field had been improved with fertilizer, or if it had been populated by the owner's herd in order to fertilize the field with their manure, then it may not be sown after the conclusion of the sabbatical year. For the sages imposed a penalty to prevent one from benefiting from prohibited labor. Right? So putting fertilizer in the field during the sabbatical year, that amounts to prohibited labor, and then the next year you can't use that field either. But removing thorns doesn't amount to that kind of prohibited labor, so the next year you can use the field. And Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Hanina, says, we have a tradition that if one improved his field in a forbidden manner and then died, his son may sow it. Right? So if he, the owner of the field, put fertilizer on it during the sabbatical year, so then the next year he can't use that field. But if he died before the next year came along and his son inherited the field, then his son can plant the field because the son did not engage in that forbidden labor of putting fertilizer on the field during the sabbatical year. So now, can we therefore learn that if a man sold his Canaanite slave to a Gentile and then he became obligated to redeem the slave in order to free him, but then he died before he could do that, do we now say that the son is not going to have the same obligation for the same reason that the son is not obligated, does not lose the use of that field after the sabbatical year? So apparently we should infer that the general principle with regard to penalties is that the sages applied the penalty to the one who committed the transgression himself, but the sages did not penalize his son who inherits him. Abaye said, we have a tradition that if someone defiled his friend's ritually pure items, thereby incurring liability to pay for the damage that he caused, and he died before paying, the sages did not penalize his son after him to pay for the damage. What is the reason for this? Damage that is not evident, i.e., that does not involve physical change to the goods, that is visible to the eye, this is not considered damage by Torah law, though it is considered damage by rabbinical decree. But since the other party did suffer a loss, there is the penalty of the sages. And the sages applied the penalty only to the one who caused the damage himself, but the sages did not apply the penalty to his son. So if somebody violated a Torah prohibition, then no one else can benefit from that prohibited labor. But if somebody violated a rabbinic decree, he cannot benefit from that prohibited labor, but others can. New subject. The Mishnah taught that if one sells his slave to a Gentile or to a Jew outside of the land of Israel, then the slave is emancipated. And the sages taught, with regard to one who sells his slave to a Jew outside of the land of Israel, the slave is emancipated, but he nevertheless requires a bill of manumission from his second master. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says sometimes he is emancipated and sometimes he is not emancipated. How so? If the master said, so-and-so, my slave, I sold him to so-and-so of Antioch, then he is not emancipated, because it is possible that he describes the purchaser this way because he was born in Antioch, but now he lives in the land of Israel. However, if he said, I sold him to so-and-so of Antioch, who is in Antioch, then the slave is emancipated, as the owner's statement clarifies that he is selling his slave to one who lives outside the land of Israel. The Gemara challenges, but isn't it taught in that same Baraisa, if the owner said, I sold him to so-and-so of Antioch, then the slave is emancipated. But if he said, I sold him to so-and-so of Antioch who dwells in Lod, which is a city inside of the land of Israel, then the slave is not emancipated. And this indicates that if he states that he sold the slave to so-and-so of Antioch without further comment, the slave is emancipated. And this is not in accordance with the statement of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Gemara answers, it is not difficult. This case, when he is not emancipated, is referring to when the purchaser from Antioch has a house in the land of Israel. And it may be that he purchased the slave to serve in his house in the land of Israel. That case in which the slave is emancipated is referring to when he has only an inn where he is staying in the land of Israel, and the only home belonging to the purchaser is outside the land of Israel. Again, remember, the reason that the slave would become emancipated, even if you sold him to another Jew, is because that Jew lives outside the land of Israel. And when the slave leaves the land of Israel, there are certain commandments that he became obligated in when he became a slave of a Jewish family that he won't be able to perform if he dwells outside the land of Israel. Again, this is all within the context of ancient Israel, when slavery existed, when the temple was standing, and when there was the commandments that applied then applied. So Rabbi Yirmiyah raises a dilemma. If there was a resident of Babylonia who married a woman in the land of Israel, if there was a resident of Babylonia, Babel, who married a woman in the land of Israel, and she brought into the marriage slaves and maidservants, female slaves, for him, and he intends to return to Babel, then what is the law? Is marrying him akin to selling the slaves to her husband? Since he plans to take them out of the land of Israel, will they then become emancipated? Let the dilemma be raised in two different ways. Let it be raised according to the one who said the law is with her, that in the event of divorce, the slaves remain in her possession, and her husband cannot pay her for them in order to maintain possession of them. Right? So in that case, she definitely, even though she brought slaves into the marriage, if it's agreed upon that when she leaves the marriage, she takes her slaves with her, then in no way can you say that the husband, who is a Jew who lives outside of Israel, that he acquired the slaves from her. And let the dilemma be raised according to the one who said that the law is with him, and he may pay her and retain possession of the slaves. Right, so now if she brings these slaves into the marriage where she is a Jew living in Israel who owns slaves, and she marries this Jew who lives in Bavel outside of Israel, and he's going to have the opportunity that if they divorce, then he can keep the slaves, well then maybe the act of marrying him already is like selling slaves to a Jew who lives outside of Israel, in which case perhaps the slaves become emancipated now. Now the Gemara explains, let the dilemma be raised according to the one who says that the law is with her. And since the law is with her, the slaves are therefore considered to be hers. And it is not considered as if she sold them, and consequently they are not emancipated. Or perhaps, since they are liened to the husband, for him to keep the profits of the slave's labor, as the profits from their labor belong to the husband, like the revenue from other property that a woman brings into the marriage, then the slaves are considered as his, and it is as though he purchased the slaves. And let the dilemma be raised according to the one who says that the law is with him. And since the law is with him, the slaves are therefore considered as his, and they should be emancipated. Or perhaps, since the husband did not acquire the slave himself, but only the rights to the slave's labor, the slaves are considered as hers. No answer was found, and the Gemara concludes that teku, the dilemma shall stand unresolved. Now, what's not stated here, I'm not sure if we're going to come to it later. Well, what if a Jew who lives in Israel and owns a Canaanite slave moves to Babel, right? Moves to Babylonia and takes that Canaanite slave out of Israel. Does the slave become freed then? There was no sale, right? So unclear. I would say, on the one hand, the Canaanite slave now is not able to perform those commandments, just like the master is not, because they left Israel. On the other hand, just because they moved to Babel doesn't mean that they can't move back to Israel. So I don't know what the answer to that question is. Rabbi Abahu says, Rabbi Yochanan taught me if there was a slave who willingly followed his master to Syria. Here we go. If there was a slave who willingly followed his master to Syria, which is considered to be outside the land of Israel with regard to the sale of slaves, and his master sold him there, different, then the slave is emancipated. The Gemara challenges, but didn't Rabbi Chia teach if a slave left the land of Israel willingly, he lost his right to be emancipated if he is then sold outside of the land of Israel? So interesting. In my example, a Jew who owns a Canaanite slave leaves Israel, right? Then what happens? Well, the first question to ask is, did the slave leave willingly with the master? Since when do slaves have a choice? Perhaps in this question they do. If they're owned by a Jewish owner who leaves Israel, maybe the slave can appeal to the rabbinic court and say, well, my master's leaving Israel. I don't want to leave Israel. And perhaps then the court will arrange that either the slave becomes emancipated or perhaps the slave is sold to another Jew who's going to remain in Israel. Let's see what it says. The Gemara answers, this is not difficult. Here, where he is emancipated, it is referring to a case where his master's intention upon traveling to Syria was to return. And the slave followed him under that assumption. So then you can leave because you're coming back. Therefore, when the master sold the slave in Syria, it is as though he sold him from the land of Israel to outside of the land of Israel. And there, where he is not emancipated, it is referring to a case where his master does not intend to return. And the slave followed him under that assumption. Since the slave willingly left the land of Israel permanently, he lost his right to be emancipated if he is then sold outside of Israel. And the Gemara notes that this distinction is taught in a Baraisa. The slave follows his master to Syria. And the Gemara asks, must he follow? Is it not possible for him to not follow his master? But didn't we learn in a Mishna? All may ascend to Israel, i.e. a woman or slave can say that he or she wishes to ascend, and they may do so against the wishes of their husbands or masters. But all may not remove, i.e. one cannot force his slave to leave the land of Israel with him. Rather, the Baraisa should be understood as speaking after the fact. If a slave willingly followed his master to Syria and his master sold him there, then if his master's intention when he traveled to Syria was to return to the land of Israel, then he is forced to emancipate the slave. But if his master did not intend to return to the land of Israel, and the slave willingly left with him, then he is not forced to emancipate the slave, as the slave lost his right to be emancipated if he is sold outside of the land of Israel when he consented to leave Israel, since he did have a choice. As I said at the beginning of class, look how many rights slaves, even Canaanite slaves, had under Torah law and under the authority of the sages. When you imagine what the life of a slave was like in any other country, right? They had no rights whatsoever, no choice whatsoever, no protection whatsoever. Rav Anan said, I learned 2 laws from Mar Shmuel. One was this law, that a slave is emancipated after being sold to someone outside the land of Israel. And the other law I learned is, as it was stated, that there was a dispute with regard to the following issue. Certain types of fields that were sold before the Jubilee year are returned to their original owners in the Jubilee year. What is the law with regard to one who sells his field during the Jubilee year itself? And Rav said it is sold in principle. However, it leaves the possession of the purchaser immediately, and the purchaser is not refunded his money. And Shmuel says it is not sold at all. I'm very close to done. Questions or comments, get them in. Rav Anan continues his statement with regard to the 2 laws he was taught by Mar Shmuel. In one of the 2 sales, the money received from the sale is returned, and in the other of the 2 sales, the money received from the sale is not returned, and the purchaser loses his money. But I do not know in which of the cases the money is returned and in which of the cases the money is not returned. And we will leave off with that cliffhanger. Okay, let's see if we've got any questions or comments. I know it is late on a Saturday night. Joseph, what again is the proper definition of the ger toshav? There's another category, the ger tzaddik as well. The latter is a full convert, right? Correct, right? So the ger toshav, this is the resident alien. And so this is the one who does not become a Jew, but who dwells. Now this is, we're talking about dwelling in Israel, not like modern Israel, but Israel when Israel is under the sovereignty of the Jewish people. And, I think the majority of the Jews in the world live there, right? So that hasn't existed since we had, ancient Israel, where many laws applied that don't apply now. What we're talking about there is a Gentile who moves into the Holy Land and then lives by the Noahide laws, meaning he gives up whatever idolatrous religion he was practicing before he moved to Israel, as opposed to just a Gentile who lives in Israel and, continues his idolatrous ways. So that's a ger versus that's a foreigner, a stranger, versus the ger toshav, and then the ger tzaddik, I guess that's the term, is the one who is a full convert and becomes a Jew. That's what I've got for us tonight. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, Sunday, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night. Have a great week.